The Callahan Ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather purchased these 500 acres back in 1937 with money saved from working 12-hour days at the railroad. He chose this land specifically for the clear creek that runs through the eastern pastures, providing life-giving water in a region where moisture is precious and rain unpredictable. My father expanded the operation, carefully managing our water sources to support our cattle herd and the alfalfa fields that feed them throughout the winter months. I was born in the same farmhouse where I now live. Every morning for the past 47 years, I have watched the sun rise over those eastern hills, casting long shadows across the land that has sustained my family for decades. The morning routine never changes. Coffee on the porch while the day is still cool. Check the irrigation channels before the heat of the day. Move the cattle to fresh pasture when needed. Repair fences that have weathered another season of harsh elements. This land does not just represent my livelihood. It contains my history. The old oak tree still bears the rope swing my father hung when I was 7. The south pasture holds the graves of my parents, who wished to remain forever connected to the soil they loved. Every fence post, every water trough, every weathered barn board holds memories that stretch back before I was born. The first sign of trouble came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in April. I was repairing a section of fence along the western property line when a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. 3 black luxury vehicles moved down my access road, which had never seen anything fancier than my 15-year-old pickup truck. The vehicles stopped at the edge of my front yard, and 6 people in business attire stepped out, looking immediately uncomfortable in the dry heat. A man with silver hair and an expensive watch approached me first. "Mr. Callahan, I am Marcus Reynolds, president of the Canyon Creek Estates Homeowners Association. We have some matters to discuss regarding your property." I removed my work gloves and extended my hand. "Call me John. What can I help you with?" Reynolds barely touched my hand before withdrawing his own. Canyon Creek Estates is expanding its development. Phase 3 requires additional water infrastructure. Our engineers have determined that the most efficient route for our new pipeline is through this section of your property. He gestured vaguely toward the creek that had watered my cattle for generations. My stomach tightened. That creek is not for sale. It supports my entire operation. A woman in a tailored blue suit stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, we are not asking to purchase your water. We simply need an easement to run our pipeline through your property to access our water sources upstream." "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer from their confident expressions. Reynolds smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. "We have easement rights through properties in this area due to county ordinances supporting essential infrastructure development. We are here as a courtesy to inform you of our plans. Construction will begin next month." I felt my face grow hot. This is my land. My family has worked it for 3 generations. You cannot just come in here and— "Mr. Callahan," Reynolds interrupted, "we understand your attachment to your property. However, Canyon Creek Estates represents over 300 families who need reliable water access. The county commissioners have already expressed support for our expansion plans. Fighting this will only cost you money and time." They left papers on my kitchen table before departing. Legal documents filled with language about easements, county ordinances, and development rights. Their vehicles kicked up dust as they drove away, leaving me standing in my yard feeling like a stranger on my own land. 3 days later, surveyors appeared along the creek without warning. They placed bright orange stakes in a line that cut through my best grazing land. When I approached them, they merely pointed to permits signed by the county commissioner. That night, I sat on my porch watching the stars that had guided my family for generations, feeling for the first time that the land beneath my feet might not truly be mine to protect. The morning after the surveyors arrived, I drove into town to speak with James Harlow, an attorney who had helped my father with property matters years ago. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had stood on Main Street since before I was born. The wooden stairs creaked under my boots as I climbed to his office. James greeted me with a firm handshake and a concerned expression when I explained the situation. He listened carefully, taking notes as I described the HOA representatives and their claims about easement rights. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses. "John, I wish I had better news for you. I took the liberty of researching the property records after you called. Canyon Creek Estates purchased the Warren property that borders yours to the north last year. That purchase included some questionable historical easement rights that could potentially be used to justify their pipeline project. I felt the blood drain from my face, so they can just take my land." "Not take it," James clarified, "but they may have legal grounds to use a portion of it for their infrastructure. These development-friendly easement laws were passed back in the early 2000s when the county was desperate for growth. No one thought much about how they might affect established ranching operations." 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the law firm of Bradshaw, Holt, and Pearson, representing Canyon Creek Estates HOA. Their letter explained in cold legal language that they intended to proceed with the pipeline project regardless of my objections. They cited county ordinances, state water laws, and the public good as justification. I called a meeting with neighboring ranchers at the Silver Dollar Cafe that weekend. 8 men and women whose families had worked this land for generations gathered around a table in the back room. Each had stories of development pressures, of city folks buying up properties and changing the character of our rural community. But none had faced what I was facing now. "They have done this before," said Margaret Wilson, whose ranch bordered the original Canyon Creek development. "They start small, get a foothold, then expand. The county commissioners see only the tax revenue, not what is lost." "Have you tried fighting them?" I asked. She shook her head. "They have money and lawyers, we have land and debt. It is not a fair fight." The preliminary hearing at the county courthouse was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I wore my one good suit, purchased years ago for my father's funeral. It felt tight around the shoulders now. The courtroom was cold and formal, with wood paneling, and the county seal displayed prominently behind the commissioner's bench. The contrast could not have been more stark. Marcus Reynolds and his team occupied one side of the room, 5 attorneys in tailored suits with leather briefcases and tablets. I sat alone on the other side, a single folder of documents in my hands. Commissioner Richard Thornton called the meeting to order. "We are here to consider the application of Canyon Creek Estates for preliminary approval of their Phase 3 water infrastructure project. Mr. Reynolds, you may present your case." Reynolds approached the podium with practiced confidence. "Commissioners, Canyon Creek Estates represents a significant portion of this county's tax base and population. Our expansion will bring additional revenue and jobs to the area. The pipeline is essential infrastructure that will benefit the entire community." One of his attorneys displayed maps and charts showing projected water usage and economic impact. Another spoke about the technical specifications of the pipeline and how it would minimize environmental impact. At no point did they acknowledge that the pipeline would cut through the heart of my operational grazing land. When my turn came, I spoke plainly. "My family has worked this land for 3 generations. This pipeline will disrupt my cattle operation, potentially contaminate my water sources, and permanently damage land that has been under careful stewardship for nearly a century. Commissioner Thornton barely looked up from his notes. Do you have any expert witnesses or technical data to present? I did not. My words seemed to evaporate in the air-conditioned room. The vote was unanimous. Preliminary approval granted. Construction permits to be expedited. I sat stunned as Reynolds and his team shook hands and exchanged congratulations. As I walked to my truck in the courthouse parking lot, I noticed a woman embracing Commissioner Thornton. She wore an expensive dress and a name badge that caught the sunlight. Canyon Creek Estates HOA Board Victoria Thornton, the commissioner's wife. I drove home along roads my grandfather had helped build, past fields where my father had taught me to ride a horse and mend fences. This was not just a legal defeat. It was a betrayal of everything my family had built. But as the sun set behind the western hills, casting long shadows across my land, I made a silent promise. This was only the beginning of the fight. They came at dawn, when the light was still soft and golden across the eastern pastures. A convoy of construction vehicles rumbled down my access road, sending my cattle running in panic toward the far corners of the field. Yellow bulldozers, backhoes, and flatbed trucks carrying sections of pipe large enough for a man to stand inside. The machines lined up along the marked path that cut diagonally across my best grazing land. A foreman approached me as I stood at my fence line. You got the notification, right? We start breaking ground today. I nodded stiffly. The notification had arrived by certified mail 2 days earlier. A formal letter stating that construction would begin April 15th and continue for approximately 6 weeks. It included a contact number for concerns, but made clear that the project would proceed as planned. The first tree to fall was an ancient oak that had provided shade for my cattle during summer heat for decades. The sound of chainsaws cutting through its trunk echoed across the property like a scream. When it crashed to the ground, I felt it like a physical blow. My father had once built a tree house in those branches for me during a particularly hot summer. Now it was just another obstacle to be cleared and discarded. By midday, a 20-foot wide scar stretched across my eastern pasture. The rich topsoil that had taken generations to develop was scraped aside into piles. The carefully maintained irrigation channels that had distributed water to my alfalfa fields were severed, rendering an entire section of my productive land now useless. When I approached the foreman about workers crossing into areas not marked for construction, he barely looked up from his clipboard. We have permits for the whole operation. If your cattle are bothered, maybe move them somewhere else. Those permits are for a specific corridor, I said, pointing to the orange stakes. Your men are driving equipment through my winter wheat. He glanced at the flattened crops, then held up a laminated document. We have authorization for necessary access to complete the approved project. Take it up with the county if you have issues. The next day, 3 luxury SUVs with Canyon Creek Estates parking permits appeared on my access road. Men and women in casual but expensive clothing stood at the edge of the construction zone, taking photos with their phones. One couple wandered into my vegetable garden, pointing at the construction progress visible beyond. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching them. "This is private property." The woman looked surprised. "We are just looking at our pipeline. We have every right to monitor its progress." "Your pipeline is there," I said, pointing to the staked corridor. "My garden is not part of your easement." The man laughed. "Well, technically this will all be part of our water infrastructure soon. You might as well get used to seeing us around." After a week of constant rain, the construction site became a muddy mess. The runoff from the exposed soil flowed directly into my creek, turning the once clear water a murky brown. Dead fish began appearing along the banks. My cattle refused to drink from it. I was forced to bring in water tanks at considerable expense, watching my savings dwindle with each delivery. Each legal avenue I pursued resulted in the same outcome. The county was firmly behind the development. My objections were noted and dismissed. The construction continued relentlessly. Day after day, the scar across my land growing wider and deeper. The pipeline was completed in late May, a massive steel serpent now buried beneath my property. The HOA organized a completion ceremony directly on my land without requesting permission. I watched from my kitchen window as Marcus Reynolds raised a champagne glass in a toast, surrounded by board members and select residents from Canyon Creek Estates. Their laughter carried across the newly graded ground where generations of my family had once worked cattle. That evening, I sat alone on my porch as floodlights from the construction site illuminated the night sky, drowning out the stars. To anyone looking, it would appear the HOA had won completely. My land was violated, my creek contaminated, my legal options exhausted. But appearances can be deceiving. The county record's office occupies the basement of the administration building, a fluorescent-lit room filled with metal shelving and the musty smell of old paper. I had spent 3 days there, poring over property records, easement documents, and water allocation reports, looking for anything that might give me leverage against Canyon Creek Estates. On the 4th day, as my eyes grew tired from reading faded handwriting in leather-bound ledgers, I noticed something peculiar. A document from 1908 detailed the separation of water rights from land ownership throughout the county following a severe drought. The state had established a system where water rights could be owned separately from the land through which the water flowed. I requested additional records, tracking the history of water allocations in our watershed. Hours turned into days as I followed the paper trail. My ranch had been granted specific water rights when my grandfather purchased the property, rights that had been renewed and maintained through the decades. These rights were separate from the land itself. A glimmer of hope rose within me. I called James Harlow and explained my discovery. He recommended a specialist in water rights law named Sarah Martinez, whose family had been fighting water battles across the state for generations. Her office was 3 counties over, a small adobe building with a weathered sign reading Martinez Water Law. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with precision. The separation of water rights from land ownership is common in Western states, she explained after reviewing my documents. But most people, especially developers from out of state, do not understand the nuances. She spread the maps and documents across her desk. Canyon Creek Estates secured easements to build their pipeline across your property, but from what I can see, they never actually secured the rights to the water itself. My heart raced. What does that mean exactly? Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady and certain. It means they built their pipeline on your land, but they never secured the rights to what flows through it. The water rights for that watershed are still separate from the land. And according to these notices, she held up a public notice from the county paper, those rights are currently available for purchase. The water rights had been held by a mining company that had gone bankrupt the previous year. Their assets, including the water allocations, were being liquidated. The notice had been published in the legal classified section of the county paper, a section few people ever read. How much? I asked, already calculating my assets. The amount she named made my stomach sink. It represented nearly every penny I had saved over 2 decades of ranching. But as I thought about my violated land, the contaminated creek, and the arrogant dismissal of my concerns by Marcus Reynolds, I knew what I had to do. The next weeks were a blur of financial sacrifice. I sold my prize bull, equipment I could barely afford to part with, and liquidated my retirement accounts. I borrowed against my house from the local credit union, where the loan officer had gone to school with my father. I even took 3 heirloom watches that had belonged to my grandfather to a pawn shop in the city. Every morning, I would wake before dawn and watch the construction crews continuing their work, installing pumps and control systems for the pipeline that cut across my land. They had no idea what was happening in the quiet offices of county government. The day I signed the final documents was anticlimactic. No fanfare, no dramatic music, just a bored clerk at the County Water Authority office stamping approval on the transfer of rights that would give me control over every drop of water flowing through Canyon Creek, a state's expensive new pipeline. As I walked out of the government building, I looked across the street where construction workers were installing the final monitoring equipment on my property. Their pipeline was complete, ready to deliver water to the 300 homes of Canyon Creek Estates. But without the legal right to use that water, their pipeline was nothing but an empty metal tube buried in my soil. For the first time since the black SUVs had appeared on my property, I allowed myself a small smile. The real battle was just beginning, and this time I held the most precious resource of all. The certified letter was delivered to Canyon Creek Estates HOA offices on a Tuesday morning. Inside was a simple notification. I had legally acquired all water rights for the watershed that supplied their community, effective immediately. Attached were copies of the official documents filed with the County Water Authority, the deed transfer, and the historical water rights certificates dating back to 1908. I included a personal note requesting a meeting to discuss terms for water usage moving forward. My terms were reasonable: fair compensation for damages to my property, guaranteed protections against future encroachment, and modest usage fees that would be less than what they would pay the county for the same service. The response came faster than I anticipated. By mid-afternoon, emergency vehicles with flashing lights converged on the Canyon Creek Estates clubhouse. From my truck parked across the street, I could see residents gathering, faces concerned as board members distributed copies of my letter. My phone rang at 6 that evening. Marcus Reynolds demanded I meet him at the Canyon Creek Estates Management office immediately. His voice contained none of the smooth confidence I had heard before. Instead, it trembled with barely controlled rage. The HOA office was a model of modern design, all glass and polished stone. Reynolds waited for me with 2 attorneys and the HOA vice president, a woman named Patricia Holloway, whose expression suggested she had just bitten into something sour. "What kind of game do you think you are playing?" "Callahan," Reynolds demanded as soon as I sat down. "No game," I replied calmly. "I have legally acquired the water rights that supply your community. I am here to negotiate reasonable terms for continued access." One of the attorneys, a young man with an expensive haircut, leaned forward. "These claimed water rights will not hold up in court. The county has already approved our pipeline project." "The county approved your pipeline construction," I clarified. "They did not and cannot grant you water rights that were privately held. Those rights have been legally transferred to me. Your pipeline crosses my land, but the water that would flow through it is now mine to allocate." Reynolds' face flushed red. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I have friends in every county office. Judge Williams plays golf at my country club every Saturday. Commissioner Thornton's wife sits on our board. That may be true, I acknowledged, but water law in this state supersedes local connections. These rights have been established for over a century. I placed a folder on the table containing my proposed agreement. These are my terms for water usage. They are fair and reasonable. I suggest you review them carefully. Patricia Holloway opened the folder, but Reynolds slammed his hand down on it before she could read the contents. We do not negotiate with farmers. He practically spat the last word. You have until Friday to withdraw these ridiculous claims before we bring the full force of our legal team against you. As I stood to leave, Reynolds stepped closer, his voice low. You have no idea what you are starting, Callahan. We can make your life very difficult. Zoning changes, property tax reassessments, environmental inspections. There are 1,000 ways to make a ranch unprofitable. I met his gaze steadily. And there are 1,000 days your residents can go without water while the courts decide. How many do you think it will take before they start asking questions about your leadership? That night, 2 black SUVs parked at the entrance to my property. Security guards with Canyon Creek Estates logos on their uniforms took photos of my house, my barns, my vehicles. Their headlights illuminated my front porch in an obvious attempt at intimidation. The next morning, I received a formal letter from the HOA's law firm rejecting my proposed agreement and threatening legal action if I interfered with their water supply in any way. That afternoon, a county inspector arrived unannounced to check my cattle operation for environmental violations. He found none, but the message was clear. For 3 days, I made phone calls, sent emails, and even approached individual HOA board members at local businesses, attempting to open a dialogue. Each time, I was rebuffed with increasing hostility. Reynolds had convinced them that my claims were baseless and that any day, a judge would throw out my frivolous water rights. On the 4th day, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing all the steps I had taken to resolve the situation peacefully. Every reasonable attempt at negotiation had been met with threats and dismissal. The HOA was planning to begin using the pipeline the following week, ignoring my legal ownership of the water rights completely. With steady hands, I signed the Water Authority forms that would officially exercise my rights to restrict unauthorized usage of my water. There was no joy in this moment, only the grim satisfaction of finally standing ground on solid legal footing. Sometimes, I reflected, the only language bullies understand is consequences. The process of legally exercising water rights is surprisingly bureaucratic for something so consequential. First came the official notifications, posted at required intervals along the waterway and filed with the County Water Authority. These notices, printed on blue paper and sealed with the County Water Authority stamp, declared that unauthorized use of privately owned water resources would cease within 72 hours. Next came the technical implementation. I hired a licensed water management company, the same one used by agricultural operations throughout the county. They installed a control valve at the critical junction where the water entered the HOA pipeline. Everything was done according to regulation, with proper permits and under the supervision of county water officials who, bound by century-old water law that supersedes modern development codes, had no choice but to acknowledge my legal right to control the resource. The actual moment of reckoning came without drama. No ceremonial turning of a giant valve, no countdown. Just a water technician in coveralls who made a notation on his clipboard, turned a specialized wrench, and confirmed that the flow to Canyon Creek Estates had been legally terminated. The water currently in their system would last perhaps 24 hours, depending on usage. I sat in my truck on a hill, overlooking the development, watching through binoculars as the day unfolded. By mid-morning, the first signs of awareness appeared. Sprinklers that automatically activated at 10 a.m. sputtered and died. A maintenance worker examined an outdoor faucet with confusion, tapping the handle as if that might restore the pressure. By noon, residents were emerging from their homes, gathering in small clusters on driveways and street corners, all discussing the same issue. Community pools, half drained for routine cleaning, remained that way. The fountain at the main entrance, which typically shot water 30 feet into the air, stood silent and dry. At 2 p.m., the first official response began. HOA maintenance trucks drove through the streets, followed by a water company vehicle. They checked connection points and made phone calls, confusion evident in their urgent movements. By 4 p.m., the first news van arrived, a reporter from the local station setting up for a live broadcast from the development entrance. My phone began ringing incessantly. Local reporters, county officials, even neighbors who had never taken much interest in my fight against the HOA. I let most calls go to voicemail, but answered one from Sarah Martinez, my water rights attorney. "It is hitting the fan, John," she said without preamble. "The county commissioners called an emergency session. Reynolds is claiming you have illegally tampered with essential infrastructure." "We followed every regulation," I replied. "The water authority supervised the entire process." "I know that, and the water authority knows that. Just be prepared. This is going to get uglier before it gets better." By evening, Canyon Creek Estates had transformed from an oasis of suburban comfort to the site of a humanitarian response. Red Cross trucks arrived distributing bottled water to residents. News vans from stations as far away as the state capitol lined the entrance. Social media exploded with videos of residents filling containers from water trucks while demanding answers from visibly uncomfortable HOA board members. The contrast was striking. For weeks, these same people had ignored or dismissed the destruction of my ranch land. Now, after less than a day without water, they were calling it an emergency, a crisis, a disaster. On the second day, a whistleblower from within the HOA administration leaked documents to the local newspaper. Internal memos revealed that the HOA legal team had actually identified the separate water rights issue months earlier, but had dismissed it as unlikely to be discovered, and easily handled through political connections if it becomes an issue. The memo specifically mentioned country bumpkins like Callahan, who would not have the resources or knowledge to challenge their actions. The public response was immediate and fierce. Residents who had previously known nothing about the pipeline project now demanded accountability. A hastily called HOA meeting in the community center devolved into chaos as board members attempted to explain their decision-making process to increasingly angry homeowners. "You spent our money on a pipeline that brings us no water," one resident shouted, his question captured by news cameras. "And you built it by bullying a local rancher whose family has been here for generations." By the third day, property values in Canyon Creek Estates had plummeted. Real estate websites flagged the development with a utility issue warning. Residents who could afford to do so checked into hotels. Those who could not relied on water deliveries and emergency services. On the evening of the third day, a single black Cadillac approached my property. Unlike the intimidation tactic of days before, this time the vehicle came slowly, almost hesitantly. Marcus Reynolds stepped out alone, his normally immaculate appearance now disheveled. His custom suit looked slept in, his silver hair uncombed. He walked to my porch where I sat watching his approach. Gone was the arrogant strut, replaced by the careful steps of a man who finally understood the precariousness of his position. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. I nodded, saying nothing. 300 families have no water," he said after a long silence, "including 27 with infants, 42 with elderly residents, and 5 with medical needs requiring reliable water access." "I am aware," I replied. "The Red Cross seems to be managing the situation well." He took a deep breath. "What do you want, Callahan? Money, an apology, revenge? Just name it so we can end this." I turned to look at him directly. I wanted to be treated with respect. I wanted my land and water protected. I wanted to be heard when I raised legitimate concerns. None of that seemed important to you 3 weeks ago when you were drinking champagne on my property. Reynolds looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Things are different now. I am authorized by the board to negotiate any terms you require." I stood up, looking out over my land where the pipeline scar was still visible despite efforts to restore the ground. "Be here tomorrow at 9. Bring your new board members, your attorneys, and anyone else with decision-making authority. Come prepared to listen, not dictate terms." As he walked back to his car, shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt no triumph. Only the sobering weight of power that comes from controlling something essential to human life. The water would flow again to Canyon Creek Estates, but the relationship between us would never be the same. The conference room at the First National Bank was neutral territory, equally distant from my ranch and Canyon Creek Estates. I arrived early with Sarah Martinez and James Harlow, my original attorney who had witnessed the beginning of this conflict. Through the large windows, I could see the mountains that had watched over this valley for millennia, their peaks indifferent to the human dramas that played out beneath them. Marcus Reynolds arrived with a group I did not recognize. He made introductions. "This is Elizabeth Chen, newly elected HOA president. Thomas Garcia and Paula Wilson, new board members. Our attorneys you already know." The change in leadership was my first indication that significant shifts had occurred within Canyon Creek Estates. Reynolds, still present but no longer in charge, sat slightly apart from the others. His face carried the drawn look of someone who had not slept well for days. Elizabeth Chen spoke first, her tone direct but respectful. "Mr. Callahan, we want to acknowledge the wrongs that have been done to you and your property. The previous board made serious errors in judgment and failed to respect your rights as a landowner and water rights holder." I nodded but remained silent. Words were easy. Actions would tell the true story. The negotiation lasted 7 hours. Each point was discussed thoroughly, each term carefully considered by both sides. By late afternoon, an agreement emerged that represented genuine balance rather than domination by either party. Canyon Creek Estates would pay fair market value for damages to my property, including restoration of the creek that had been contaminated during construction. An independent environmental assessment would determine the full extent of ecological harm, with remediation costs covered entirely by the HOA. The pipeline would remain, but under a formal easement agreement that included strict limitations on access and maintenance. HOA members would no longer have the right to enter my property without explicit permission. In exchange for reliable water access, the HOA would pay reasonable usage fees that acknowledged both the value of the resource and my role as its steward. These fees would not be excessive, but would ensure that water was treated as the precious commodity it truly is. Most importantly, A conservation easement would be established that permanently protected the ranch from future development. I would retain ownership and operational control, but the land itself would be preserved as agricultural open space in perpetuity, even if future generations of my family chose to sell. As the attorneys drafted the final documents, Elizabeth Chen approached me privately. "My family came from a farming community in California," she said. "I understand what this land means to you. The previous board saw only resources to be acquired, not relationships to be respected." The signing ceremony was held the following week. As a gesture of transparency, the HOA arranged for it to take place at the boundary between my ranch and Canyon Creek Estates, with residents invited to attend. Nearly 200 people gathered to witness the formal resolution of a conflict that had disrupted lives on both sides. Heavy equipment arrived the next day, not to destroy, but to restore. The same machines that had torn through my grazing land now carefully reconstructed creek banks, replanted native vegetation, and installed proper environmental protections that should have been mandated from the beginning. A community liaison committee was formed with representatives from both the ranch and Canyon Creek estates. The monthly meetings became a forum where concerns could be addressed before they escalated into conflicts. When issues arose about water usage during drought conditions, we worked together to find solutions that protected both my agricultural needs and their residential requirements. The most surprising outcome was the change in the community itself. Residents who had once viewed my ranch as merely an obstacle to their water access now gained appreciation for the agricultural heritage of the region. Educational programs were established, allowing Canyon Creek children to visit the ranch and learn about sustainable farming practices and responsible water conservation. 6 months after the water was restored to Canyon Creek Estates, a community barbecue was held on a neutral field between our properties. Residents who had once glared at me from behind security car windows now shook my hand and introduced their families. Children from the development played alongside ranch employees' children, learning that the water connecting our properties was something to be shared and respected, not fought over. As the sun set on that gathering, I stood at the edge of my property looking over the land my grandfather had purchased nearly a century ago. The pipeline scar was healing, new grass growing over the wound in the earth. Water flowed through that pipeline now, but it flowed with consent, with respect, and with mutual understanding of its value. The battle had left marks on all of us, but it had also established a new balance of power and a recognition that neither the old agricultural ways nor the new developmental pressures could exist in isolation. We were connected by the water that gave life to all of us, a resource that demanded respect rather than exploitation. As I walked back to my house along the path my father had worn through decades of morning rounds, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent through the conflict. My victory was not in shutting off their water or forcing their compliance. The true victory was in establishing a relationship of mutual respect that would protect this land and its resources for generations to come.